The air in the second-floor bedroom was unnaturally still, thick with the scent of dried lavender and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old pennies in decay. Deputy Miller stood in the doorway, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt Patterson, a pistol that felt more like a talisman than a weapon in the face of such profound quiet. It was October of 1842, and in the raw, untamed territory of Arkansas, silence was rarely a sign of peace. This silence was different. It was a weighted, watchful thing. The room was immaculate. The two narrow beds were made with military precision, their patchwork quilts pulled taut. A single wooden trunk sat at the foot of one bed, its lid closed. On the small washstand, a porcelain basin and pitcher were clean, dry, and perfectly aligned. It was the room of two people who had just stepped out for a moment, except they had been gone for 3 weeks. Miller's gaze fell upon the center of the nearest bed. There, resting on the pristine white pillow, was a single object. It was a songbird's skull, bleached bone-white and impossibly delicate. Its eye sockets were vacant, dark voids that seemed to drink the meager light filtering through the window. It was placed with the care of a jeweler arranging a precious gem. It was not a threat. It was a statement, a final, macabre punctuation mark at the end of a story that no one had yet learned how to read. Miller had seen death in all its brutal frontier forms in barroom brawls, cholera camps, and conflicts with local tribes. But this was an artifice of dread. This was a calculated, cold piece of theater designed to unnerve. He had been called to the Morton boarding house to investigate the disappearance of two sisters, Elara and Maeve Blackwood. He had expected to find signs of a struggle, a packed trunk, a note left in haste. He did not expect to find a perfect, sterile diorama of absence, curated by an unseen and unsettling hand. The songbird skull, a fragile token of death in a room frozen in time, was the first clue in a case that would descend into a horrifying abyss of forbidden science and macabre obsession. It was the beginning of a cold case that would haunt the town of Pinnacle for generations. A story whispered in hushed tones about the two sisters who vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a perfect, horrifying silence. To understand the unsettling mystery that unfolded in Pinnacle, Arkansas, one must first understand the world of 1842. This was not the America of established cities and paved roads. This was the frontier, a brutal and unforgiving landscape where civilization was a thin, fraying veneer stretched over a vast, indifferent wilderness. Life was governed by the seasons, by the unforgiving realities of crop failure and disease. The people who came here were either running from something or chasing a dream so desperate it bordered on delusion. Into this harsh reality stepped Elara and Maeve Blackwood. They arrived in late August on a dusty stagecoach, two starkly different figures cast from the same mold. Elara, the elder at 21, possessed a quiet fortitude. Her gaze was direct, her hands capable, her presence a shield against the world's cruelties. She was the pragmatist, the protector, the one who understood that survival on the frontier was a battle of attrition. Maeve, just shy of 18, was the dreamer. She carried a worn, leather-bound sketchbook and saw the world not as it was, but as it could be, in charcoal lines and watercolor hues. She saw beauty in the gnarled branches of an oak tree and poetry in the gathering storm clouds. Where Elara saw danger, Maeve saw inspiration. They were orphans, their parents claimed by a swift and merciless wave of influenza back east. With only a meager inheritance and a letter of introduction to a distant cousin who had long since moved on, they were utterly alone. Their journey to Pinnacle was an act of final, desperate hope. They sought not fortune, but a simple foothold, a place to start again, to stitch together the torn fabric of their lives. The Morton boarding house, a tall, grim-looking clapboard structure at the edge of town, was to be their sanctuary. Its advertisement, printed in a Boston newspaper weeks earlier, had promised clean rooms, nourishing meals, and a respectable environment for discerning ladies. It was a beacon of civility in a world that seemed to have little. As they stepped off the stagecoach, dust clinging to their mourning dresses, they could not have known they were walking from one form of grief into another, far more macabre and permanent. They were simply two sisters, armed with little more than their fierce loyalty to one another, stepping into the shadow of a house that was already waiting for them. The proprietor of the boarding house was a woman named Althea Morton. She was a widow, a figure as stark and severe as the house she kept. Her hair, streaked with gray, was pulled back into a bun so tight it seemed to stretch the skin of her face, giving her an expression of perpetual disapproval. She dressed in widow's weeds of black bombazine, the fabric making no sound as she moved through the dimly lit corridors. Her presence was one of absolute control and unnerving quiet. When she greeted the Blackwood sisters at the door, her smile was a brief, thin line that did not reach her pale, watchful eyes. Mrs. Morton's reputation in Pinnacle was a curious mixture of respect and fear. She was known as a woman of discipline and piety, her house a bastion of order in a disorderly town. But there were whispers, as there always are in small, isolated communities. Some said she was a gifted herbalist, capable of brewing tinctures that could soothe a fever or ease a troubled mind. Others spoke in lower tones of more disturbing things. They spoke of the unusual longevity of her guests, particularly the solitary, frail ones who arrived with deep coughs and left, months later, looking pallid but strangely preserved. Rumors circulated about the strict, almost fanatical, rules of her establishment. No visitors were allowed after dusk. Windows were to be kept shuttered at night. And under no circumstances was anyone to venture into the cellar, which she claimed was prone to flooding and black mold. To the weary and vulnerable Blackwood sisters, Mrs. Morton appeared as a savior. She offered them a room on the second floor at a rate they could just afford. She spoke of structure, of purpose, of the healing power of a quiet, well-ordered life. To Alara, this was a promise of stability. To Maeve, it was a sentence of confinement. From the moment she crossed the threshold, the young artist felt a palpable sense of unease. The air inside was heavy, scented with a cloying mix of beeswax, dried herbs, and an underlying chemical sharpness she couldn't identify. The silence of the house was not peaceful. It was suppressive, as if it were actively muffling some distant, constant scream. As Mrs. Morton led them up the creaking staircase, her hand gliding along the polished banister, Maeve clutched her sketchbook to her chest, a talisman against a creeping dread she could not yet name. She was an artist who saw the hidden truths of the world, and in the shadows of the Morton boarding house, she saw something profoundly and terrifyingly wrong. The first few weeks passed with a suffocating sense of routine. Life in the Morton boarding house was a metronome of quiet obligation. Breakfast was served at precisely 7, a silent affair of thin porridge and weak tea. The day was spent on chores assigned by Mrs. Morton, mending linens, polishing silver, tending to the strange, colorless flowers in the backyard garden. Dinner was at 6, followed by an hour of mandated Bible reading in the parlor before an early bedtime. The other boarders were a collection of solitary, spectral figures. There was a frail old man named Mr. Abernathy, who never spoke and spent his days staring out the parlor window. There was a young woman named Clara, whose persistent, rattling cough was the only sound that ever seemed to disturb the house's oppressive quiet. They moved like ghosts through the hallways, their eyes downcast, their faces pale and drawn. They seemed less like guests and more like components of the house itself, animated by Mrs. Morton's will. Alara, ever the pragmatist, saw this rigid structure as a necessary hardship. It was a roof over their heads, a way to earn their keep. She focused on the work, on the tangible reality of their survival, but Maeve felt her spirit withering. The house seemed to drain the color from the world. In her letters to a distant aunt, her only remaining family, her early descriptions of the frontier's raw beauty gave way to something darker. She wrote of the watchful silence, and the way the shadows in the corners of the rooms don't move right. She described Mrs. Morton's unnerving habit of observing them, her gaze lingering just a moment too long. In one letter, she confessed a chilling thought. "I feel as if we are not boarders here but specimens, pinned under glass for some quiet, patient study." Maeve's sketchbook, once filled with vibrant landscapes, began to change. The pages became populated with unsettling images. She drew Mr. Abernathy, but his eyes were hollow sockets. She sketched Clara, but her mouth was a dark, cavernous shape, as if captured mid-scream. Most disturbingly, she drew the house itself, but she gave it anatomical features: windows like vacant eyes, a door like a grimacing mouth, and gnarled ivy like veins crawling up its wooden skin. The house was alive, she felt, and it was hungry. She was trying to warn someone, to document the creeping horror that only she seemed to see, but her art was becoming a forbidden diary of a nightmare she couldn't wake from. The turning point came on a Tuesday in late September. It began with a sound, or rather, the lack of one. Clara, the young woman with the incessant cough, had fallen silent. For weeks, her hacking had been a constant, grim punctuation to the house's quiet rhythm. One morning, it was simply gone. The silence she left behind was louder and more unnerving than the noise had ever been. When Alara asked Mrs. Morton about her, the matron's face remained a placid mask. Clara's ailment took a turn, she said, her voice smooth and devoid of emotion. Her family was sent for. They came for her in the night. She has returned to their care. The explanation was simple, logical, but it felt wrong. No one had heard a carriage. No one had seen a visitor. The house had remained as still and silent as a tomb. That evening, Maeve saw something that solidified her growing terror. She had crept downstairs for a glass of water, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floorboards. As she passed Mrs. Morton's study, she saw a sliver of light from beneath the door. She heard a strange, rhythmic sound, a soft, wet, scraping noise. Her curiosity overriding her fear, she knelt down and peered through the large, old-fashioned keyhole. What she saw would be seared into her memory forever. Mrs. Morton was not at her desk. She was standing over a large wooden table, her back to the door. On the table lay something small and pale. At first, Maeve couldn't make sense of it. Then Mrs. Morton shifted and the candlelight caught the object. It was a bird, a sparrow, its wings splayed, and Mrs. Morton was working on it with a set of small, gleaming silver instruments. She was not plucking it or preparing it for a meal. She was engaged in something meticulous, surgical. With delicate precision, she was removing the bird's internal organs, replacing them with wads of cotton and strange, dark herbs. It was a taxidermy of the most grotesque and intimate kind. Maeve recoiled from the door, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a gasp. This was no simple hobby. This was a ritual. The scraping sound, the focused intensity, the almost reverent way Mrs. Morton handled the tiny corpse. It was a horrifying, forbidden art. And in that moment, Maeve understood. She understood the strange chemical smells, the matron's watchful gaze, and the profound, deathly stillness of the house. This was a place where things were not just laid to rest. They were preserved. Maeve's terror was a living thing now, a frantic bird trapped in her chest. She rushed back to their room and shook Alara awake, her words tumbling out in a panicked whisper, describing the macabre scene she had witnessed through the keyhole. She spoke of the bird, the silver tools, the unnatural concentration on Mrs. Morton's face. She insisted that Clara hadn't been taken by her family, that something terrible had happened to her right here, within these oppressive walls. Alara, ever the voice of reason, tried to calm her younger sister. She saw the fear in Maeve's eyes, but she sought a logical explanation. "She's a naturalist, Maeve," Alara reasoned, her voice a low murmur in the dark. "A scientist, perhaps. It's a strange hobby, yes, but it doesn't make her a monster. We are on the frontier. People have their own ways." Alara argued that Maeve's artistic temperament was making her see specters where there were only shadows. She was exhausted, homesick, and grieving. It was natural that her imagination would run wild in such a grim, unfamiliar place. But Maeve was inconsolable. "You didn't see her eyes, Alara," she whispered, her body trembling. "It was a hunger, a kind of focus I've never seen. She wasn't just stuffing a bird, she was perfecting it." She grabbed her sketchbook and flipped to a new, frantic drawing. It depicted a human figure laid out on a table, surrounded by the same silver instruments. The drawing was faceless, but its implication was clear and horrifying. The sisters were now divided by a chasm of belief. Alara clung to logic, to the desperate need for their situation to be normal, to be safe. She could not afford to believe in monsters. Their survival depended on this place being what it seemed. To admit Maeve was right would be to admit they were trapped in a predator's lair with no means of escape. Maeve, on the other hand, had seen past the veil. She could no longer unsee the macabre truth hiding in plain sight. This disagreement, born of love and fear, would be their undoing. As they argued in hushed, desperate tones, neither of them noticed the floorboard that creaked just outside their door. Neither of them saw the shadow that paused, listened, and then silently slipped away into the all-consuming darkness of the hallway. Mrs. Morton now knew she had been seen. The quiet, patient study was over. The next phase of her work was about to begin. The atmosphere in the house shifted after that night. The oppressive quiet was now charged with a new, predatory tension. Mrs. Morton's demeanor towards the sisters changed in a subtle but chilling way. Her thin smiles vanished completely, replaced by a constant, unnerving scrutiny. Her eyes seemed to follow them everywhere, measuring them, assessing them. The already meager portions of food at mealtime seemed to shrink further, but their water pitcher was always kept full of a strange, sweet-tasting herbal infusion that Mrs. Morton insisted was for their nerves. Alara, despite her initial skepticism, could not deny the change. She noticed that Mr. Abernathy, the silent old man, was now gone. His room was empty, his bed stripped, as if he had never been there at all. Mrs. Morton offered the same placid explanation. His family had sent for him. The excuse was wearing thin, becoming a horrifyingly predictable epitaph for the vanished. Alara found herself watching Maeve with growing concern. Her sister was becoming increasingly frail and paranoid. She refused to eat the food or drink the water, subsisting on the few dried biscuits she had saved from their journey. She barely slept, and when she did, she was plagued by nightmares that left her waking with a silent scream. Her sketchbook became her only refuge, and its pages grew more and more disturbing. She drew Mrs. Morton again and again, but now the matron had elongated fingers tipped with surgical steel, and her shadow was a vast, monstrous thing that swallowed everything it touched. Alara realized with a sinking heart that Maeve had been right. There was a palpable evil in this house. Her pragmatism had blinded her, had made her a willing accomplice to their entrapment. She decided they had to leave. They would pack their single trunk in the dead of night and slip out before dawn. They would take their chances in the wilderness rather than spend one more night under Mrs. Morton's watchful eye. It was a desperate plan, born of a terror that had finally broken through her wall of denial. That evening, as they pretended to sleep, they listened for the sounds of the house settling. For the first time in weeks, they felt a sliver of hope. They were together, they had a plan, and they would escape. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed they were the only ones with a plan. They believed they were acting in secret, unaware that in the Morton boarding house there were no secrets from its keeper. The house itself was an extension of her will, its creaks and groans her informants, its shadows her allies, and she had no intention of letting her prized specimens leave. Just after midnight, when the moon was hidden behind a thick shroud of clouds, the sisters began to move. They worked in absolute silence, communicating with gestures and glances. Alara carefully lifted their small wooden trunk onto the bed to muffle the sound of its packing. Maeve gathered their few belongings, dresses, a hairbrush, her precious sketchbook. Every rustle of fabric, every creak of the floorboards under their feet, sounded like a cannon shot in the tomb-like silence. A cold draft slithered under the door, carrying with it the familiar scent of herbs and chemicals, and Maeve shuddered, her eyes darting towards the hallway. They were almost ready. Alara had just secured the latch on the trunk when she paused, her head tilted. A new sound had joined the quiet hum of the night. It was a soft, rhythmic scratching coming from directly beneath them, from the floorboards. At first she dismissed it as a rat, but the sound was too deliberate, too methodical. It was the sound of metal scraping against wood. Maeve heard it too, her face paling in the sliver of moonlight that broke through the clouds. She looked at Alara, her eyes wide with a question that needed no words. The scratching stopped. It was replaced by a low, guttural groan of stressed wood. A floorboard near the washstand lifted a fraction of an inch, then settled back down. They stared at it, frozen. Someone was in the room below them. Someone was trying to get in. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Alara's composure. The doors were not the only way in or out of these rooms. Her mind raced, replaying Mrs. Morton's words. The cellar is prone to flooding. It was a lie. It was a workshop. The house was honeycombed with secret passages, with hidden ways for the predator to access her prey. The scratching began again, more insistent this time. It was the sound of screws being turned, of a hidden panel being unfastened. They were not trapped in a room, they were trapped in a cage, and the keeper was coming to collect them. Alara grabbed Maeve's hand, her mind scrambling for an escape that she knew, with sickening certainty, did not exist. The window was their only hope. But as Alara lunged for it, she saw a dark shape move outside, a figure standing in the garden below, looking up, waiting. The house was surrounded. There was no escape. The moment stretched into an eternity of suspended horror. The scratching from below, the figure in the garden, the suffocating silence pressing in from all sides. Alara's mind, once so clear and rational, was now a maelstrom of terror. She dragged the heavy wooden trunk and wedged it over the section of floorboards that was being tampered with. It was a futile gesture, a child's defense against a nightmare, but it was all she could do. Maeve, meanwhile, was no longer panicking. A strange, almost serene calm had settled over her. She walked to the small writing desk, picked up a quill, and opened her final letter to their aunt, a letter she now knew would never be sent. Her hand moved with a feverish intensity, the scratching of her nib on the paper a counterpoint to the more sinister scratching from below. She was no longer writing a letter. She was bearing witness. She was documenting their final moments, ensuring that the truth of this place, the macabre reality of Mrs. Althea Morton, would not simply vanish with them. "She is not a woman," Maeve wrote, the ink bleeding slightly from the force of her hand. "She is a collector. She does not take life, she stills it. She sees beauty not in a bird's song, but in its silent, perfect form." Outside, the figure in the garden remained motionless. Alara, peering through a crack in the shutters, could now make out that it was a man, large and imposing, holding something that looked like a burlap sack. He was an accomplice. This horrifying enterprise was not a solitary obsession. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. A deafening silence fell over the house once more. The sisters held their breath, straining to hear. Then a new sound began, a soft, sweet melody. It was a music box, its delicate, tinkling notes rising up through the floorboards. The tune was a lullaby, a gentle, soothing melody that was grotesquely out of place with the terror of the moment. It was the most horrifying sound they had ever heard. It was the sound of the trap springing. The music grew louder, more present, as if the box were right there in the room with them. A faint, sweet-smelling vapor began to seep up through the gaps in the floor, carrying the melody with it. It smelled of lavender and chamomile and something else, something cloying and medicinal. It was the smell of Mrs. Morton's special herbal infusions. The lullaby was not meant to soothe them. It was meant to subdue them. As the first wave of dizziness hit Alara, she understood. They were being gassed, smoked out like bees from a hive. Her last conscious thought was of her sister, still writing, a final act of defiance against the encroaching, melodic darkness. Deputy Miller arrived at the boarding house 3 weeks later. The official report was initiated by a concerned letter from the sisters' aunt in Boston, who had not received her weekly correspondence from Maeve for almost a month. The postmaster in Pinnacle confirmed no letters from the Blackwood sisters had been sent out. It was a small deviation from the norm, but in a place as isolated as Pinnacle, small deviations were often the first signs of a larger tragedy. When Miller knocked on the heavy oak door, it was opened by Mrs. Althea Morton herself. She was the picture of calm composure. Her explanation was simple and delivered with a sigh of practiced disappointment. The Blackwood sisters, she claimed, had run off. She spoke of Maeve's artistic temperament and Alara's restless spirit. She suggested they had grown tired of the frontier's hardships and had likely taken the midnight stagecoach east, seeking a softer life. She even produced a note, supposedly written in Alara's hand, which spoke of their departure and thanked Mrs. Morton for her kindness. The handwriting was a near-perfect forgery, but Miller, a man accustomed to the tells of liars, saw something in her eyes, a flicker of something other than concern. It was a proprietary stillness, the placid confidence of a predator whose den has been approached but not yet breached. He insisted on seeing their room. Mrs. Morton obliged without protest, her movements serene and unhurried. She led him up the stairs, the scent of lavender and beeswax growing stronger with each step, and it was there, in that unnervingly sterile room, that he found the songbird's skull. It was the one detail Mrs. Morton could not explain away. When he questioned her about it, her placid mask finally slipped. For a fraction of a second, a look of pure, cold fury flashed in her eyes before being replaced by a mask of confused innocence. "A childish trinket, I imagine," she said smoothly. "Perhaps something Maeve found on one of her walks." But the skull was not a trinket. It was a message. And as Miller stood there in that cold, silent room, he knew he was not investigating a simple case of two runaway girls. He was standing on the precipice of something deep, dark, and fundamentally wrong. The house itself seemed to be watching him, holding its breath, daring him to uncover the forbidden secrets hidden within its walls. The history of this cold case is filled with such disturbing details, and if you are compelled to uncover more forbidden stories like this one, consider subscribing to our channel. The secrets buried beneath Mrs. Morton's floorboards are far more macabre than any town rumor. Deputy Miller's investigation began in earnest, but he was immediately met with a wall of silence and fear. When he questioned the other residents of Pinnacle about the Morton boarding house, their reactions were telling. They would praise Mrs. Morton's piety and the orderliness of her establishment in one breath, and in the next, their eyes would shift, their voices would drop, and they would make the sign against the evil eye. They spoke in vague terms of the house's strangeness. Travelers who checked in were sometimes never seen again, their departures always explained by a sudden summons from family or an unexpected business opportunity elsewhere. The turnover of guests was unusually high, yet Mrs. Morton never seemed to lack for income. They whispered about the large, silent man who worked as her groundskeeper and handyman, a hulking figure named Silas who only came out at night. He was the one who tended her strange garden of pale, scentless flowers and carried heavy burlap-wrapped parcels into the cellar at odd hours. No one ever saw what was in the parcels, and no one dared to ask. Miller tried to question Silas directly, but the man was a mute, communicating only in guttural grunts and menacing glares. His hands were as large as shovels, his knuckles scarred and bruised. He was less a handyman and more of a guard dog, loyal only to his mistress. The investigation felt like punching at smoke. There were no bodies, no witnesses to a crime, only a thick miasma of rumor and a collection of unnerving coincidences. The forged letter was a dead end. Without a sample of Alara's true handwriting to compare it to, it was merely Mrs. Morton's word against the sister's silence. The most promising lead was Maeve's final, unfinished letter, which the aunt had forwarded to the authorities. Miller read it over and over, the young woman's frantic words painting a picture of escalating psychological terror. "She is a collector," Maeve had written. "She stills it." The words were poetic, hysterical, and deeply disturbing. To the town constable, they sounded like the ramblings of a disturbed mind. But to Miller, they felt like a key. He didn't know what it meant to still life, but the phrase echoed in his mind, resonating with the image of the perfectly placed bird skull. He knew the answer was not in the town, but in the house. He needed to get back inside, not as a guest, but as an intruder. He needed to see the one place Mrs. Morton had forbidden anyone from entering, the cellar. Miller knew a direct confrontation would be fruitless. Mrs. Morton was a fortress of plausible deniability. He needed a warrant, but he had no concrete evidence of a crime, only a disappearance, a strange skull, and a collection of chilling but unsubstantiated rumors. So he resolved to break the law to enforce it. He would enter the house at night, when its mistress and her monstrous guardian were asleep. He spent a day observing the house from a distance, hidden in a thicket of trees. He watched the comings and goings, which were non-existent. He watched the lights in the windows, noting which ones were lit and when they were extinguished. He saw Silas emerge at dusk, his hulking frame moving with an unsettling grace as he worked in the garden. He saw Mrs. Morton's silhouette in the parlor window, sitting ramrod straight in her chair, a silent, waiting sentinel. He formulated a plan. The house's weakness was its kitchen window at the back, its latch old and likely rusted. Silas, for all his imposing presence, was a creature of routine. He patrolled the grounds once at 9 and again at midnight before retiring to a small shack behind the main house. Miller would make his move in that 3-hour window. As night fell, a heavy, moonless dark descended on Pinnacle, cloaking the world in an inky blackness that seemed to emanate directly from the Morton house itself. Miller, dressed in dark clothing, moved through the shadows, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. The air grew cold as he approached the house, the scent of rot and damp earth mixing with that now familiar chemical sweetness. He reached the kitchen window. As he had predicted, the latch was old. With a bit of pressure from his knife, it gave way with a soft, metallic groan. He slid the window open, hoisted himself over the sill, and dropped silently into the belly of the beast. The darkness inside was absolute, a physical presence that seemed to deaden all sound. He was immediately struck by the smell. It was stronger in here, a nauseating cocktail of formaldehyde, strange herbs, and the faint, coppery tang of blood. It was the smell of a slaughterhouse disguised as a sanctuary. He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer being cocked sounding like a thunderclap in the oppressive silence. He was no longer a deputy. He was a trespasser, a hunter, and he knew with chilling certainty that he was not the only one hunting in this house tonight. Navigating by touch and memory, Miller made his way from the kitchen towards the center of the house, where he presumed the cellar door would be. The floorboards groaned under his weight, each sound a betrayal. The air was thick and cold, and the silence was alive, listening to his intrusion. He found the door beneath the main staircase, just as he'd expected. It was made of heavy, reinforced oak and secured with not one but 3 large iron bolts. This was no ordinary cellar door. It was a vault. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of dread through him. Whatever Mrs. Morton was hiding, she was desperate to keep it hidden. Working carefully with a set of lockpicks, a skill he'd acquired in a past life he preferred not to speak of, he began to work on the bolts. The mechanisms were old but well-oiled. The first bolt slid back with a dull thud. Then the second. As he worked on the third and final bolt, he heard a sound from upstairs. A floorboard creaked. Miller froze, every muscle tensed. He held his breath, listening. Was it Mrs. Morton? Silas? Had he been discovered? He waited for what felt like an hour, his pistol aimed up the dark staircase, but the sound did not repeat. He dismissed it as the house settling, a trick of his own frayed nerves. He returned to the lock. The final bolt slid open. He took a deep breath, pulled the heavy door towards him, and was immediately hit by a wave of foul, refrigerated air. The stench that rose from the darkness below was overwhelming, a concentrated version of the smells from upstairs, but with an added, horrifying note of decay. It was the smell of death, but not a clean death. It was the smell of preserved decay, of something that should have rotted but was artificially held in a state of grotesque permanence. He lit the oil lamp he had brought with him, its small flame pushing back the suffocating blackness. He held it out and peered down a set of steep stone steps that disappeared into the gloom. The light flickered, casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the damp stone walls. Taking another steadying breath, he began his descent into the forbidden heart of the Morton house, stepping down into a place that he knew, instinctively, was a tomb. The secrets of the vanished sisters were here, in the cold and the dark, and he had a terrifying premonition that they were not secrets he was prepared to uncover. The cellar was not a cellar. It was a laboratory. The moment Miller reached the bottom of the steps, his lamplight revealed a scene of such calculated scientific horror that it defied comprehension. The large, open space was meticulously organized. Along one wall stood a series of tall glass cabinets. Inside, displayed like museum specimens, were dozens of animals: birds, squirrels, foxes, even a young deer. They were all in perfect, lifelike poses, a sparrow in mid-flight, a fox curled as if sleeping. But their eyes were glass, and their bodies, upon closer inspection, bore faint, almost invisible seam lines. This was the product of the macabre art Maeve had witnessed, perfected to a horrifying degree. On a long wooden workbench in the center of the room lay the source of the chemical smell. Beakers, glass vials filled with colored liquids, and complex-looking distillation equipment sat alongside the same kind of gleaming silver instruments Maeve had described. Scalpels, forceps, and fine-toothed saws, all neatly arranged on a velvet cloth. This was a place of science, but a twisted, unholy perversion of it. Miller's eyes were then drawn to a collection of large leather-bound ledgers on a writing desk in the corner. He picked one up, its cover cold and damp to the touch. He opened it. The pages were filled with Mrs. Morton's elegant, spidery handwriting. But these were not financial records. They were scientific journals, filled with detailed notes and anatomical drawings of terrifying precision. She documented her experiments in a chillingly detached, clinical tone. She wrote of her attempts to halt the process of decay, of her search for the perfect combination of embalming fluids, of her quest for what she called permanent stasis. She was not merely a taxidermist. She believed that by perfectly preserving the physical vessel at the exact moment of death, she could somehow trap a residual echo of the soul. She was trying to conquer death itself, not by preventing it but by curating it. As Miller flipped through the pages, his horror grew. The subjects of her later entries were no longer just animals. The drawings began to change, the anatomy shifting from animal to human. He saw sketches of hands, of faces, of entire bodies, all annotated with notes on tissue density and fluid displacement. He had found Mrs. Morton's secret, but he had not yet found her secret collection. His hands trembling slightly, Miller continued to turn the pages of the journal. He was looking for two names, Alara and Maeve. He found them in the final entries of the most recent volume. The clinical detachment of the writing was gone, replaced by an almost feverish excitement. Mrs. Morton referred to the sisters not by name, but as the specimens. Specimen E, for Alara, was described as resilient with excellent tissue integrity. Specimen M, for Maeve, was noted for her delicate bone structure and translucent skin, which Mrs. Morton believed would be an exquisite canvas for the final stages of the process. The entries detailed the gradual, systematic poisoning of the sisters through the herbal infusions in their water. The dosage was carefully calibrated to weaken their bodies without leaving any visible trace, preparing them for what she called the great work. The final entry was dated the night of their disappearance. It read, "The specimens have become aware. The process must be accelerated. Silas will assist. Tonight we achieve permanence." Miller slammed the book shut, a cold rage mixing with his fear. The songbird's skull was not a message, it was a trophy, a symbol of Maeve, the little songbird, finally silenced and made permanent. He now knew without a doubt that the sisters were dead, but their bodies were not buried in some shallow grave in the woods. They were here, somewhere in this horrifying cellar. His lamplight scanned the room again, moving past the cabinets of silent animals, past the alchemical workbench. His gaze fell upon a section of the far wall. It was made of newer-looking brick, the mortar still relatively fresh. It didn't match the old, damp stone of the rest of the cellar. There was no door, no handle. But there was a faint outline, a rectangle about 7 feet high and 10 feet wide. He walked over to it, his boots crunching on the grimy floor. He ran his hand over the bricks. They were cold, solid. He pressed his ear against the wall and heard nothing but the pounding of his own blood. Then he saw it. Near the floor, almost completely hidden in the shadows, was a small, ornate keyhole, identical to the one on the study door upstairs. Mrs. Morton hadn't bricked up a wall. She had built a room, a vault, a private, forbidden gallery for her most prized acquisitions. And Miller knew with sickening, absolute certainty what he would find on the other side. The key was not hard to find. It was on a small, ornate hook on the side of the writing desk, labeled with a single, elegant M for Morton, or perhaps for Macabre. Miller's hand shook as he inserted the key into the hidden lock. The mechanism turned with a well-oiled, almost silent click. There was a faint grinding sound, and a section of the brick wall swung inwards, revealing a darkness that seemed colder and more absolute than the cellar itself. The smell that billowed out was the same chemical odor, but purer, sharper, and without the undertone of decay. It was the sterile scent of perfect, horrifying preservation. He raised his lamp, its flickering light penetrating the gloom. His breath caught in his throat. He had stepped into Althea Morton's masterpiece theater. The room was not large, perhaps 10 feet by 10 feet, and its walls were draped in black velvet, absorbing the light and creating an atmosphere of infinite depth. In the center of the room, positioned on two ornate velvet-draped platforms, were the final, horrifying works of her collection. It was Alara and Maeve. They were not lying down, nor were they posed in some grotesque tableau of death. They were sitting upright in high-backed chairs, facing each other over a small, elegant table. On the table was a porcelain tea set, a cup raised to Alara's lips, a book of poetry open in Maeve's hands. They were dressed in their finest clothes, their hair perfectly coiffed. Their skin was pale and waxy but flawless. Their eyes, their glass eyes, were open, staring at each other with a look of serene, empty placidity. It was a perfect, eternal moment, frozen in time. A macabre tea party for the dead. Miller felt a wave of nausea and vertigo wash over him. This was not murder as he understood it. This was an act of monstrous art. Mrs. Morton hadn't just killed them. She had transformed them, turning them from living, breathing people into objects, into the crowning jewels of her forbidden collection. He saw the faint seam lines along their wrists and necks, the same masterful, invisible stitching he had seen on the animals. He saw the faint, rosy blush on their cheeks, a pigment painted on to mimic a life that was long, long gone. This was the meaning of Maeve's words. She stills it. This was permanent stasis. And it was the most profoundly disturbing thing Deputy Miller had ever seen. For a long moment, Miller could do nothing but stare, his mind struggling to process the sheer, calculated insanity of the scene before him. The quiet dignity of the tableau was its most horrifying feature. Mrs. Morton had not desecrated their bodies. She had canonized them according to her own twisted gospel. He took a step closer, his lamplight tracing the delicate features of Maeve's face. The artist who had seen the world with such vibrant life was now a permanent, lifeless sculpture. Her hand rested on her sketchbook, which was open on the table beside the poetry book. Driven by some grim impulse, Miller reached out and tilted the book towards the light. The final page was filled with a single, frantic sketch. It was not of Mrs. Morton or the house. It was a drawing of Alara, her face a mask of terror, her mouth open in a scream that Maeve had captured on the page moments before her own end. And beneath the drawing a single scrawled word. Listen. Listen. To what? The silence of the tomb was absolute, and then he heard it. The same sound he had dismissed upstairs, a floorboard creaking in the main cellar just outside the vault. It was followed by a heavy, shuffling footstep. Miller spun around, extinguishing his lamp with a flick of his thumb, plunging the room into total darkness. He drew his pistol, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was not alone. He backed away from the diorama, pressing himself against the cold velvet of the far wall, his pistol aimed at the faint rectangle of gray that marked the entrance to the vault. He could hear heavy, labored breathing now, just on the other side of the opening. The shuffling footsteps grew closer. A massive silhouette blocked the entrance, a figure so large it seemed to suck all the residual light from the cellar. It was Silas, the silent guardian, and he was not empty-handed. In one of his massive fists, he held a long, gleaming butcher's cleaver. He stood there for a moment, his head tilting from side to side like a great, dumb animal sniffing the air. He knew someone was here. The trap Miller had walked into was not just the house. It was this very room, a place where intruders could be cornered, silenced, and perhaps even added to the collection. The silence in the vault was a taut wire stretched to the breaking point. Miller stood motionless in the pitch black, his breathing shallow, his senses screaming. He could smell Silas, a rank odor of sweat, damp earth, and something metallic like old blood. The hulking form of the handyman filled the doorway, a terrifying monolith of brute force. The cleaver in his hand hung limply, but it was poised, ready. Miller knew that the first sound, the first movement, would bring a swift and brutal attack. He was a good shot, but in this claustrophobic darkness, a single shot might not be enough to stop a man of Silas's size before that cleaver found its mark. Time seemed to warp, each second elongating into a minute. Silas took a slow, shuffling step into the vault. He still hadn't seen Miller, who was pressed into the corner behind the diorama of the dead sisters. The handyman's head continued to move from side to side, his breathing a low, guttural rumble. He was hunting by sound, by scent. Miller's mind raced. He had one advantage, surprise, but how to use it? Firing the gun would be a gamble. The muzzle flash would blind him and the sound would be deafening, disorienting him as much as his target. There was another way. He holstered his pistol, the movement slow and deliberate, making no sound. He reached down and gripped the base of the heavy, high-backed chair upon which the preserved body of Alara was seated. It was his only hope, a desperate, macabre gambit. With a guttural roar that was part battle cry and part scream of pure terror, Miller shoved the chair and its horrifying occupant forward with all his might. The diorama crashed into Silas's legs. The handyman let out a bellow of surprise and pain as he stumbled, his cleaver swinging wildly in the dark. The sound of porcelain shattering echoed through the vault as the tea set hit the floor. In that split second of chaos, Miller lunged for the doorway. He scrambled past the flailing giant, the wind from the cleaver whistling past his ear, so close he felt its cold passage. He burst out of the vault and into the main cellar, not daring to look back. He could hear Silas roaring in fury behind him, the sound of the heavy diorama being thrown aside. Miller didn't stop. He sprinted for the stone steps, taking them two at a time, his lamp forgotten in the horrifying dark below. He had seen the truth. Now he had to survive it. Miller burst through the cellar door and slammed it shut, fumbling with the iron bolts. He managed to slide one, then two of them into place just as Silas's immense weight crashed against the other side. The wood groaned, the hinges straining, but the bolts held. The impact was followed by a series of thunderous, rhythmic blows as Silas began to attack the door with his cleaver, the sound of splintering oak echoing through the silent house. Miller knew the door wouldn't hold for long. He had to get out and he had to alert the town. He turned from the cellar door and ran towards the main staircase, his path lit only by the faint moonlight filtering through the parlor windows. And then he saw her. Althea Morton was standing at the top of the stairs. She was no longer the stern, composed matron. She was a figure of pure, unrestrained malevolence. Her hair had come loose from its tight bun, framing a face contorted with cold fury. In her hand she held an old, horse-sized pistol, its long barrel aimed directly at his chest. "Deputy," she said, her voice a low, venomous hiss, "you have broken the rules of my house. You have disturbed my collection." There was no pretense anymore, no mask of civility. He was seeing the true woman, the predator whose sanctuary he had violated. The rhythmic booming from the cellar door provided a horrifying percussion to their standoff. "It's over, Althea," Miller panted, raising his own pistol. "The town will know what you are. They will know what you did to those girls." A strange, thin smile touched her lips. It was a look of pity, of condescension. "This town," she scoffed. "This town is a collection of superstitious, ignorant fools. They fear what they don't understand, and they will believe the story I tell them, the story of a deranged deputy who broke into the home of a grieving widow and met with a tragic accident." Behind him, a final, deafening crack signaled that the cellar door was giving way. He was trapped between the monster below and the monster above. He had a choice to make, and only a second to make it. He could fire at Mrs. Morton, but Silas would be on him before he could recover. He could turn and face Silas, but that would leave him open to her. It was a perfectly designed trap, and he was standing right in the center of it. In that split second, with Silas's enraged roar rising from the splintered cellar door behind him and Mrs. Morton's pistol aimed at his heart, Miller made a choice that was neither attack nor retreat. It was chaos. He fired his pistol, not at Mrs. Morton, but at the large, ornate oil lamp hanging from the ceiling in the main hall. The lamp exploded in a shower of glass and burning oil. Flames erupted, instantly catching on the dry wooden paneling of the walls and the dusty runner on the stairs. The hall was plunged into a maelstrom of fire and smoke. Mrs. Morton cried out in rage and surprise as the flames shot up between them, obscuring her from his view. Miller dropped to the floor, crawling beneath the rapidly thickening smoke, and scrambled towards the front door. Behind him, he heard Silas burst from the cellar, bellowing in fury, the sound quickly turning into a scream of pain as the flames found him. The fire was an indiscriminate beast, consuming everything in its path, the secrets, the horrors, the collector and her collection. Miller fumbled with the bolts on the front door, his lungs burning, his eyes streaming. He threw the door open and stumbled out into the cool night air, gasping for breath as the house behind him became a raging inferno. Flames licked out of the windows, painting the night sky in horrifying shades of orange and red. He didn't look back. He ran, his legs pumping, his mind a whirlwind of the atrocities he had witnessed. He ran until the roar of the fire was a distant sound, until the Morton boarding house was just a malevolent orange glow against the horizon. He had survived. He had escaped. But he knew this was not a victory. He had not brought justice for Alara and Maeve. He had merely presided over the desecration of their tomb. The fire would destroy all the evidence, leaving nothing but ash and speculation. The macabre truth he had uncovered would be consumed, transformed into the very thing Mrs. Morton had feared, a ghost story, a legend whispered by the firelight. The truth, in all its horrifying detail, was now his burden alone. By the time Deputy Miller returned with the town constable and a handful of volunteers, the Morton boarding house was little more than a skeletal frame, its blackened timbers groaning as they collapsed into a smoldering pyre. The fire had done its work with terrifying efficiency, erasing the house and its forbidden secrets from the landscape. The official investigation that followed was a study in frustration. When the ashes cooled, searchers combed through the rubble. They found the charred remains of the cellar, but the intense heat had caused the stone walls of the hidden vault to collapse, burying whatever lay within under tons of debris. No intact bodies were ever recovered. They found fragments of bone, but in the absence of forensic science, it was impossible to determine if they were animal or human, or to whom they might have belonged. Mrs. Althea Morton and her handyman, Silas, were never seen again. The official conclusion was that they had perished in the blaze they had likely started themselves to cover their escape. Warrants were issued for their arrest, but they were never served. It was as if the earth had simply swallowed them whole. Miller told his story, of course. He spoke of the cellar, the journals, the taxidermy, and the horrifying final tableau of the Blackwood sisters. But without a shred of physical evidence, his account sounded like a madman's fever dream. The town constable, a man of simple facts and figures, looked at him with pity. The townsfolk, already predisposed to superstition, latched onto the more supernatural elements of the tale. The story of the macabre collector and her scientifically preserved victims was too complex, too disturbing to be believed. It was easier and far more comforting to believe that the house was simply cursed, haunted, and that the Blackwood sisters had been taken by ghosts. The case was officially closed, the file stamped with the words disappearance, presumed deceased. The horrifying, tangible truth that Miller had witnessed was relegated to the status of folklore. The story of the Boardinghouse sisters became a cautionary tale told to frighten children, a local legend stripped of its terrible, factual core. Alara and Maeve Blackwood vanished twice, once from their room, and again from the pages of history, their true fate banned from the public record by fire and disbelief. In the aftermath, the town of Pinnacle tried to forget. The land where the boarding house once stood became a blighted patch, where grass struggled to grow and children dared each other to tread. The name Morton was spoken only in whispers, a verbal curse that people were afraid to utter too loudly. Deputy Miller, however, could not forget. The images from that night were burned into his mind more permanently than any fire. He was hailed as a hero for surviving the blaze, but he felt like a failure. He had been the sole witness to a truth so monstrous it defied belief, and now he was its only keeper. The burden of this knowledge began to eat away at him. He became withdrawn, obsessive, spending his nights poring over what little evidence remained. Maeve's frantic, unfinished letter. He read her words, "She is a collector. She stills it," until they lost all meaning and became a torturous mantra. He saw the face of Mrs. Morton in every shadow, heard Silas's footsteps in every creaking floorboard. Sleep offered no escape, as his dreams were haunted by a silent tea party and the vacant, glass eyes of the dead. He resigned from his post less than a year after the fire, unable to continue the mundane work of a frontier lawman after having stared into such a profound abyss. He became a wanderer, drifting from one dusty town to another, a man haunted by ghosts that no one else could see. He would sometimes tell his story to strangers in dimly lit taverns, his voice low and intense, but his audience would just see a drunk, broken man spinning a tall tale. They could not comprehend the reality of what he was describing. They could not understand that the monster he spoke of was not a creature of fantasy, but a woman of flesh and blood, of science and obsession. The macabre case of the Boardinghouse sisters became Miller's personal curse, the defining and destructive event of his life. He was the last living link to Alara and Maeve, and their silent screams would echo in his mind until the day he died, a lonely, misunderstood prophet of a horrifying, forgotten gospel. What then became of Althea Mortain? History provides no clear answer, but the folklore that sprouted from the ashes of her house offers some chilling possibilities. The official story is that she died in the fire, a fittingly dramatic end for a woman of such dark secrets. But in the years that followed, strange rumors and unsettling sightings began to surface in other remote, frontier towns. A decade later, in a small, isolated community in the mountains of Colorado, a stern widow with piercing pale eyes opened a new boarding house. She kept to herself, was known as a gifted herbalist, and her establishment quickly gained a reputation for its impeccable order and its almost supernatural quiet. Young, solitary travelers who were new to town would sometimes take a room there and then would be heard from no more. Their departures were always explained by plausible stories, a sudden inheritance, a family emergency. The pattern was eerily familiar. Was this Mrs. Morton, having adopted a new name, continuing her great work? Had she and the monstrous Sela's escaped the flames, carrying her precious journals and her forbidden knowledge with them? Another, more disturbing legend suggests something else. Some of the whispers in Pinnacle claim that Mrs. Morton was not just a woman, but something older, something that had been practicing its art for centuries. They pointed to the fact that no one in town knew where she had come from. She had simply arrived one day, fully formed, as if out of the ether. They claimed the fire had not destroyed her, but had merely forced her to shed her current identity, like a snake shedding its skin. This version of the story transforms her from a mere serial killer into a figure of immortal, macabre evil, a wandering predator moving through the lonely places of the world, seeking new specimens for her ever-growing collection. These are just stories, of course, the kind of tales that spring from a deep, collective trauma, but they speak to the profound horror left in her wake. The evil she represented was so absolute, so beyond the normal scope of human cruelty, that people could not accept it had simply been extinguished. It had to live on, a continuing threat, a curse set loose upon the world. The true horror of the Morton case is not just what happened to the Blackwood sisters, but the chilling possibility that their fate was not an ending, but merely one chapter in a much older, much longer, and much more horrifying story. Let us now return to the physical evidence, or what little of it remains. The most tangible artifact of this entire macabre affair is Maeve's sketchbook. It was not in the trunk with their other belongings but was tucked under her mattress. In the chaos of the fire, Deputy Miller, acting on some deep, intuitive instinct, had instructed the constable to secure the sisters' room as best they could. The room itself was consumed by the blaze, but the trunk and some of the bedding were salvaged, waterlogged and smoke-damaged, but partially intact. The sketchbook survived. Today it is held in a private collection, its pages yellowed and brittle, smelling faintly of smoke and time. To look through it is to witness a young woman's descent into a waking nightmare. The early pages are filled with the hopeful, vibrant sketches of a talented artist discovering a new world. There are detailed drawings of wildflowers, panoramic views of the rugged landscape, and a touching, tender portrait of her sister Alara smiling. But as you turn the pages, the tone shifts dramatically. The art becomes darker, more frantic. The landscapes become menacing, the trees like grasping claws, the sky heavy and oppressive. The portraits of the other boarders, Mr. Abernathy and Clara, are skeletal and haunted. Then the focus turns to Mrs. Mortain. She is first depicted as a severe, shadowy figure, but with each subsequent drawing she becomes less human. Her fingers elongate, her shadow warps into a monstrous shape. The final pages are a fevered dream of horror. There are sketches of the house with a human heart beating at its center. There are drawings of birds with human eyes. And most disturbingly, there are repeated, obsessive sketches of surgical instruments, scalpels, needles, saws, all gleaming with a sterile, terrifying light. The sketchbook is more than just a collection of drawings. It is Maeve's testimony. It is a visual record of the creeping dread, the psychological unraveling, and the horrifying truth she had uncovered. It is the only voice the victims have left. In a case with no bodies and no confessions, this fragile book of paper and charcoal is the only proof that the horrors Deputy Miller described were not the product of a troubled mind, but the grim reality of what happened inside that forbidden house. It is the final, defiant act of a young artist who, even as she was being consumed by darkness, used her gift to scream a warning out to the world. The science that Mrs. Morton was practicing, while twisted and horrifying, was not pure fantasy. The mid-19th century was a period of immense scientific discovery, but it was also a wild west for experimentation, unburdened by the ethical regulations of the modern era. The lines between anatomy, biology, chemistry, and more esoteric pursuits like alchemy were often blurred. The practice of artistic anatomy was gaining popularity, with physicians and artists alike seeking to perfectly understand and replicate the human form. At the same time, techniques for preservation were making great leaps. Embalming, as we know it today, was being developed, primarily for the purposes of transporting the war dead. Early pioneers in the field were experimenting with a variety of chemical cocktails, injecting arsenic, zinc chloride, and other toxic substances into the circulatory system to halt decay. Mrs. Morton, in her isolated laboratory, appears to have been a dark pioneer in this field. Her journals, as described by Miller, suggest she had developed a unique and horrifyingly effective method. Her goal was not simply to preserve the dead for burial, but to achieve a state of perfect, lifelike stasis. This required a level of artistry and chemical knowledge that was far beyond that of a simple undertaker. She was combining the preservative qualities of arsenic and mercury with the flexible, hardening properties of certain plant-based resins, creating a solution that would not just halt decay, but would set the body's tissues in a semi-pliable state before they became rigid. This would allow her to pose her specimens in the lifelike dioramas Miller discovered. We are now approaching the heart of this macabre case, the part of the story that was banned from public record. For those who have the stomach to see this through to its horrifying conclusion, your support helps us unearth more cold cases like this one. What she was doing was a grotesque fusion of the undertaker's science, the sculptor's art, and the serial killer's obsession. Her method was likely one of gradual poisoning, to prepare the body and minimize post-mortem changes, followed by a final, complex embalming procedure performed almost immediately at the moment of death. The house was not just her home. It was a human processing facility, designed to transform living people into permanent, macabre works of art. The psychological profile of a killer like Althea Mortain is as complex and disturbing as her methods. She was not a disorganized, impulsive predator. She was a collector in the truest sense of the word, exhibiting traits of extreme narcissism, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and a complete lack of empathy. To her, people were not human beings with hopes, dreams, and fears. They were objects, raw materials for her art. Her choice of victims was meticulous. She preyed on the vulnerable and the transient, those without strong family ties, those whose disappearance would not trigger an immediate and forceful investigation. The orphan sisters, Ilara and Maeve, were the perfect specimens. They were alone, new to town, and their only connection to the outside world was a distant aunt who communicated by slow, infrequent mail. Mrs. Morton offered them sanctuary, a classic predator's tactic of luring prey with the promise of safety. Once they were within her walls, she began the slow, methodical process of psychological and physical breakdown. The rigid routine, the isolation, the drugged water, It was all designed to weaken their will, to make them more compliant, more perfect for the final process. Her motivation was likely not a simple lust for violence. It was something far more abstract and grandiose. In her mind, she was not a murderer. She was an artist and a philosopher. She was conquering death, the ultimate human fear. By stilling life, by capturing a person in a single, perfect, permanent moment, she believed she was achieving a form of godhood. She was creating an immortality that was, in her view, superior to the messy, unpredictable, and decaying reality of actual life. The diorama Miller discovered was not just a trophy room. It was her chapel. It was a place where she could worship her own creations, where she could admire her victory over the natural order of things. This level of delusion, combined with a high degree of intelligence and meticulous planning, makes her one of the most terrifying types of killers imaginable. She was not driven by rage or passion, but by a cold, rational, and artistic obsession. One of the most unsettling elements of this case is the role of the silent accomplice, Silas. While Mrs. Morton was the architect of this horror, her work would have been impossible without her monstrous handyman. Who was he, and what was the nature of his loyalty to her? The town's whispers provide few clues. He was a mute, a figure of brute strength who seemed to possess a dog-like devotion to his mistress. It is likely that he was more than just an employee. Their relationship was probably a symbiotic one, a dark partnership rooted in mutual dependence. Silas may have been a social outcast, a man whose physical deformities or mental deficiencies made him a pariah. Mrs. Morton may have taken him in, offering him a form of acceptance he could find nowhere else. In return for this sanctuary, he became her hands, her muscle, her guardian. He was the one who procured larger animal subjects for her early experiments. He was the one who dug the graves for her failures. He was the one who carried the heavy parcels into the cellar and stood guard over the house's forbidden secrets. And most chillingly, he was likely the one who physically subdued the victims when the time came for the final process. He was the brute force that enabled her delicate, macabre art. His loyalty was probably not born of love or respect, but of a shared darkness. He may have possessed his own violent urges, which Mrs. Morton's work allowed him to channel and express in a controlled environment. He was not just her servant. He was her enforcer, the physical manifestation of the violence that underpinned her sterile, scientific pursuits. Together, they formed a perfect, horrifying unit, the mad artist and her loyal golem. The partnership elevates the case from the story of a single, deranged woman to a more complex conspiracy of evil, a small, self-contained cult of two, dedicated to a religion of death and preservation. Silas's presence makes the story even darker, proving that Mrs. Morton's evil was persuasive enough to bind another human soul to her monstrous work. Let us reconsider the songbird skull. In the initial investigation, it was viewed as a clue, a trophy, or a simple, macabre message. But given what we now know about Mrs. Morton's obsession with symbolism and artistry, it is likely that its meaning was far deeper and more personal. Maeve, the younger sister, was the artist, the dreamer. She was described as having a delicate, almost fragile beauty. To Mrs. Morton, she would have been the songbird of the pair. The placement of the skull, bleached, perfect, and silent, resting on the pristine white pillow where Maeve's head once lay, was a final, chillingly artistic statement. It symbolized the completion of her work. The bird's song, its life, its messy, fleeting essence was gone. What remained was its perfect, permanent, and silent form. This was the core of Mrs. Morton's philosophy. The skull was not just a trophy of her kill, it was a symbol of her artistic achievement. It was her signature, left at the scene of her greatest triumph. It represented the transformation of life into art, of a living, breathing person into a silent, curated object. Furthermore, the choice of a skull, rather than a fully preserved bird, is significant. The skull is the core, the essential structure that remains long after the flesh has rotted away. It is a symbol of ultimate permanence. By placing it on the pillow, Mrs. Morton was communicating, perhaps only to herself, that she had not just captured Maeve's fleeting beauty, but had secured her very essence for eternity. It was an act of profound, narcissistic arrogance, a final piece of theater in her macabre production. The songbird skull, therefore, becomes the central icon of the entire case. It is the beginning and the end of the story, a single, horrifying object that encapsulates all of Mrs. Morton's twisted ideology. It is a testament to the idea that for some, the line between art and atrocity is not just blurred, but entirely non-existent. The fire that consumed the Morton boarding house is often seen as a cleansing force, an act of righteous destruction that wiped a great evil from the earth. But what if it was not? What if the fire was not an accident of chaos, but a deliberate, final act by Mrs. Morton herself? Consider the standoff described by Deputy Miller. Mrs. Morton held the high ground, her pistol aimed. Sela's was moments from breaking through the cellar door. They had Miller trapped. Why then would she allow him to shoot the lamp? Her calm, condescending tone suggested a woman in absolute control. It is possible that Miller's action was not a surprise to her, but was, in fact, anticipated. Perhaps it was even desired. Mrs. Morton was a perfectionist. Her collection was her life's work, a gallery of flawless, permanent beauty. Miller's intrusion had violated her sanctuary. He had seen her masterpieces. In her mind, he had contaminated them with his profane, living gaze. For a narcissist of her magnitude, such a violation might be unforgivable. If she could not keep her collection pure and secret, then no one could have it. It is entirely plausible that she had a contingency plan for just such a scenario. The fire was not Miller's desperate act of escape. It was her scorched earth policy. By allowing the house to burn, she was not just covering her escape. She was curating the final chapter of her own story. She was destroying her work rather than letting it be seized and misunderstood by a world she despised. It was the ultimate act of a possessive artist. In this light, the fire becomes not an act of justice, but the final, terrible stroke of her macabre masterpiece. It transformed her house of horrors into a legendary pyre, ensuring her story would become a myth rather than a criminal record. It allowed her to vanish, to rise from the ashes of her old life and begin anew, unburdened by the physical evidence of her past. The fire did not cleanse her evil, it liberated it, allowing it to escape back into the world. The fate of Alara and Maeve Blackwood is, in many ways, one of the most tragic footnotes in the annals of American cold cases. They were not the victims of a random act of frontier violence. They were the targets of a sophisticated, patient, and highly intelligent predator who saw them not as people, but as a unique artistic opportunity. Their story is a chilling reminder of the vulnerability of those who exist on the margins of society. As orphans, as women, and as newcomers to a rough and indifferent town, they were effectively invisible. This invisibility, which they hoped to overcome, was precisely what made them attractive to Mrs. Morton. Their fierce loyalty to one another, which should have been their greatest strength, was ultimately used against them. Alara's pragmatism made her slow to believe Maeve's fears, creating a window of opportunity for Mrs. Morton to continue her work. Maeve's artistic sensitivity allowed her to see the truth, but it also marked her as fragile, as hysterical, making her warnings easy for her stronger sister to dismiss. Their story is a classic, tragic archetype. The Cassandra figure Maeve, who sees the coming doom but is not believed, and the pragmatist Alara, whose reliance on logic blinds her to a reality that operates outside of it. They were trapped not just by the walls of the house, but by their own natures and the bond that held them together. In the end, Mrs. Morton did not just take their lives, she took their story. By transforming them into objects, she stripped them of their humanity, their individuality. The Tea Party tableau was her final, contemptuous act, reducing their complex lives and relationship into a single, shallow, and serene image. The real tragedy is not just their death, but the chilling success of their erasure. Had it not been for Deputy Miller's stubborn intuition and Maeve's surviving sketchbook, they would have been just two more forgotten names on a long list of people who vanished into the vast, unforgiving American frontier. The legacy of the Morton boarding house extends beyond the whispers and ghost stories of Pinnacle. It serves as a dark mirror, reflecting the underbelly of the American dream. The 19th century was an age of progress, of manifest destiny, of the belief that humanity, through science and reason, could conquer nature and even death itself. This was the era of Frankenstein and other Gothic tales that explored the terrifying consequences of scientific hubris. The story of Althea Morton is a real-world manifestation of that Gothic horror. She represents the darkest possible extension of the Enlightenment ideal. She took the principles of observation, experimentation, and the pursuit of knowledge and twisted them into a tool for monstrous self-aggrandizement. Her work was a perversion of the scientific method, driven by an artist's obsession rather than a desire for truth. The frontier setting is crucial to this theme. The wilderness of Arkansas was a place with fewer rules, less oversight, a place where a person with dark proclivities could operate with a degree of freedom impossible in the more civilized East. The house itself, standing at the edge of town, was a symbol of this duality, a facade of civility on the edge of a vast, untamed wilderness. But the true wilderness was not outside the house, it was within its keeper. The case forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural creatures hiding in the woods, but human beings who use the tools of reason, science, and art to serve an irrational and inhuman purpose. Mrs. Morton was a product of her time, an extreme and horrifying example of the belief that everything, even human life, could be mastered, categorized, and perfected through sheer force of will. Her legacy is a chilling warning about the darkness that can hide behind a mask of intellect and propriety, and the terrible things that can happen when the pursuit of perfection becomes divorced from all morality. Could something like this happen today? It is easy to dismiss the case of the Boardinghouse sisters as a relic of a bygone era, a horror story made possible by the isolation and lack of forensic science of the 1840s. In our modern world of interconnectedness, of CCTV, DNA analysis, and digital footprints, surely a predator like Mrs. Morton could not operate for long without being discovered. Or could she? The core elements of her strategy remain terrifyingly relevant. She preyed on the invisible, the marginalized, those who fall through the cracks of society. Today, these individuals still exist. The homeless, the runaway, the undocumented immigrant. People whose disappearance might go unnoticed for weeks or months or forever. A modern-day Althea Morton might not use a boarding house as her lair, but could instead operate under the guise of a charitable shelter, a remote wellness retreat, or a private, unregulated clinic. The tools of her trade would be different, but the underlying principles would be the same. The science of preservation has advanced to unimaginable degrees. Plastination, the process of replacing bodily fluids and fat with plastics, can create specimens of astounding durability and realism, permanent, odorless, and perfectly preserved. A killer with the right knowledge and resources could create a modern collection that would make Mrs. Morton's work look crude by comparison. The most chilling thought is that the desire to collect people, to own and objectify them, is a dark psychological impulse that has not vanished with time. While the methods may change, the monstrous obsession remains a part of the human condition. The story of the Blackwood sisters is not just a piece of dark history, it is a timeless warning. It reminds us that evil is patient, intelligent, and endlessly adaptable, and that the most vulnerable among us are always at its mercy. Ultimately, the macabre case of the Boardinghouse sisters remains suspended in a state of horrifying ambiguity. We have Deputy Miller's terrifying account, Maeve's haunting sketchbook, and a smoldering crater of ash where the truth was buried. But we are left with more questions than answers. Did Mrs. Morton and Selah's truly perish in the fire, a final, ironic act of destruction for a woman obsessed with preservation? Or did they escape, melting back into the shadows of the frontier to begin their work anew? Are there other collections, hidden away in the cellars of forgotten houses across the country? The story exists now in the realm of folklore, a place where fact and speculation bleed into one another. The lack of resolution is, perhaps, the most unsettling part of the entire affair. It denies us the comfort of closure, the satisfaction of justice served. The evil at the heart of this story was never captured, never punished, never truly understood. It simply vanished. This allows the story to function as a powerful modern myth. Mrs. Morton becomes more than just a 19th century killer. She becomes an archetype, a boogeyman representing the fear of hidden evil lurking just beneath the surface of the mundane world. She is the quiet neighbor, the stern landlord, the person in a position of trust who harbors a monstrous secret. The story preys on our deepest anxieties about vulnerability, about trusting the wrong person, about the terrifying possibility of simply disappearing from the world without a trace. It is a cold case in the truest sense of the word, not just unsolved but unsolvable, its central mystery sealed forever by fire and time. The truth is as lost and as silent as the sisters themselves, leaving behind only a chilling echo and a profound sense of unease. In the end, we are left where we began, in a silent room with a single macabre clue, the songbird skull. It is the alpha and the omega of this story, a perfect, silent testament to a crime that was almost perfect itself. It represents Maeve, the artist, the sensitive soul who saw the horror and tried to warn others. It represents Mrs. Morton's twisted philosophy, her belief in the supremacy of form over life. And it represents the profound, horrifying silence that fell over the lives of two young women who came to the frontier seeking a new beginning and found, instead, a permanent, macabre end. The story of Alara and Maeve Blackwood is a disturbing journey into the darkest corners of obsession and the terrifying potential of the human mind when untethered from empathy. It is a reminder that the most chilling histories are not always found in the grand battles or epic sagas, but in the quiet, forgotten places where ordinary lives intersect with extraordinary evil. The fire that destroyed the Morton house may have consumed the evidence, but it could not destroy the story. It smolders still, a lingering ember in the dark history of the American frontier, a cautionary tale that whispers a single, chilling message down through the generations. Be careful who you trust. Be careful of houses that are too quiet, for in the silence, some of the most horrifying secrets are kept, and some of the most macabre art is made, and some souls, once they have vanished, can never truly be found.